I'll never apologize for the United States of America. Ever. I don't care what the facts are.
Why are we going to sit down and talk to these quote-unquote moderate rebels?
Who are the truly moderate rebels?
The search for the moderate rebel. Do these moderate rebels exist?
Moderate
rebels.
You are listening to Moderate Rebels. I'm Ben Norton here with Max Blumenthal. Today we're joined by the Yemeni activist Shireen al-Adeimi to discuss the largest humanitarian catastrophe in the world. This is an issue that has not gotten much media coverage, and this March 26th was the third anniversary of the war. On March 26, 2015, Saudi Arabia launched a bombing campaign inside Yemen, which has devastated the poorest country in the Middle East, led to, as you will see, hundreds of thousands of deaths, preventable deaths, and created the biggest humanitarian catastrophe on the planet. So today we'll be discussing a lot of issues, and there are so many things to unpack about this conflict. The role of the U.S., Saudi Arabia, UAE, the U.K., but then there's also many other things, not just the humanitarian toll. There's also the political divisions inside the country, the distinctions between North and South Yemen, the splits between people in the South who support the Saudi-backed government and then people who support the Houthi movement, and also people who supported the former president. So there's a lot to unpack, and I don't want to overwhelm people at the beginning here, but we have the perfect guest to unpack this with. Shireen al-Adeimi is a graduate student at Harvard University, where she's doing her doctoral work in education. And for the past 3 years, since this war has been going on, Shireen has been one of the leading activists helping to bring attention to the U.S.'s leading role in this war on the country in which she was born, Yemen. So Shireen, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. This is, I think, one of our most important episodes, in part because of the dearth of accurate or contextual media coverage in the U.S. A lot of Americans found out about Yemen or discovered its existence from a 60 Minutes episode or 60 Minutes segment. The correspondent was Clarissa Ward, who I've previously reported was a CNN correspondent who actually worked with members of Al-Qaeda to gain access to rebel territory in Syria, and has produced several commercials for the Free Syrian Army and the Al-Qaeda linked rebels. She's, obviously someone who reinforces U.S. foreign policy on a lot of levels. And so, sending her into Yemen was going to produce a kind of both sidesy episode that really left Americans with the impression that this was just a humanitarian catastrophe. Poor people are just in Yemen being poor, and we have to help them. Maybe we can have a We Are the World concert, and Bruce Springsteen will come back from oblivion and hold hands with Billy Joel and Lionel Richie, or we'll get like more, newer people and sing for Yemen. Obviously, this is a human-made catastrophe. It's the result of outside forces intervening in Yemen. And I wonder, how you would counter the narrative that this is just a, humanitarian catastrophe brought on by poverty, or that, both sides, both Saudi Arabia and Iran are equally responsible for the plight of Yemen.
Right. I think there's a lot of misinformation when there is any information on Yemen. And one of the most important aspects is that Iran is involved, and this is some kind of proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And B, that this is just, too bad for Yemenis. They probably are used to this conflict, and now it's just gotten from bad to worse. And there's very little emphasis, if at all, on how U.S. involvement and really a lot of foreign actors have helped shape this conflict. So what happened is, Yemen was undergoing civil disruption, civil war, and you had foreign agents who decided to involve themselves in this war and turn it into the worst humanitarian crisis we have on earth today. So the U.S. is heavily implicated in this war. One of the senators, Senator Chris Murphy, says there's a U.S. footprint on every war crime that Saudi Arabia commits in Yemen. And then to present this conflict as something that's just happening to some people elsewhere that we're not really involved with was just extremely, extremely disappointing and irresponsible journalism.
Well, just give us your history of the war. Take us through the beginning of the Civil War. I think as far as I know, there might have been a possibility of, negotiated settlement, and then Saudi Arabia intervenes. What happens next? Just take us through it real quick and give our listeners some context for understanding what's happening before we move on.
Right. So quick rundown. In 2011, starting in January, Tunisia, began its Arab Spring Revolution, what was later named Arab Spring. And Yemen was one of those countries in January 2011 that decided they were going to revolt. At least certain segments within Yemeni society began to revolt peacefully against the then President Saleh, who had been ruling for 33 years up until that point. And it started off as a peaceful revolution, people just marching in the streets for a few months to try to, bring about change in the country. That all turned south when Saleh's former allies joined the opposition. And I think that was the turning point, and that's when peaceful demonstrations turned violent, because now the Islah Party, who were, partners in crime with Saleh all these years, decided that they were going to join the opposition. And clashes erupted, and there was an assassination attempt. And that's when Saleh ended up getting a negotiated settlement. He resigned. Saudi Arabia and the GCC were involved in that. And, he handed power to his vice president at the time, Hadi, who was just appointed essentially. And he had a 2-year term to, work with various groups, including the Houthis, including the Islah Party and various other groups, to try to form a new unity government. And Saleh remained the most powerful man in Yemen. He remained in Sana'a and remained in control of the military despite not being president anymore. And then I think, the failure here was Hadi's failure. He failed to bring about any kind of change. And when the Houthis marched to Sana'a to bring about pressure, he resigned and then tried to take back his resignation, and then, fled to Aden and began calling for Saudi to intervene. Saudi, of course, was already planning on intervening. And they began bombing Yemen 3 years ago. And so, we have this civil unrest. There was potential for this to be civil war, full-blown civil war, but not to the extent that we see now. And things just basically went degraded right after Saudi Arabia began bombing.
Well, and then of course something I think we need to keep in the back of our minds is that we can't go into the entire history, but this of course goes back much further than 2011. In fact, you mentioned Islah, which is, this right-wing Muslim Brotherhood-affiliated political party in Yemen, which is somewhat influential. It is also a notorious competitor against the Houthis, which are, Zaydi in theological orientation. I mean, this is not. I always stress to people, this is not a religious conflict at all, but these are Islamist movements that have a particular orientation. But specifically, Islah was created and funded by Saudi Arabia during the Cold War in order to undermine Marxist rebels inside North Yemen. And Yemen was divided until 1990. And we'll talk more about that later. But the point I'm making simply is that Saudi Arabia's intervention goes back throughout the Cold War. Yemen was a key area. There was another civil war during the Cold War in Yemen. So what we're seeing today is in many ways kind of echoes of this past history where Saudi Arabia treats the country to its south, Yemen, as a kind of colony. And of course, the US and the UK, specifically the UK, did previously colonize Yemen. So I just want to, that's very brief, but I want to mention that. And then another quick point I'll add, and I'm interested in your thoughts, is a key talking point we've heard in much of the discussion, not just in the media, but from the United Nations and such, is you mentioned Hadi. Hadi, for listeners, is technically the internationally recognized president in the south of Yemen, even though he controls only about 20% of the populated territory. Everyone refers to him, from U.S. media outlets to the United Nations to the U.S. government, as the internationally recognized president. You pointed out that Hadi himself actually resigned. He overstayed his term in office, and then he resigned. And this was after he won a so-called election in which he was the only political candidate. So can you talk more about the actual politics? Because this is a misleading point we've heard, that the Houthi movement in the north and supposedly Iran, which is greatly exaggerated, are combating this so-called democratically elected, internationally recognized government.
Right. Going back to your first point, Saudi Arabia absolutely has been involved in Yemen throughout its history. You know, in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s, they've always taken sides. I think what's going on right now, this represents the most overt intervention they've had in Yemen. But yes, they've intervened all throughout. And I think this intervention was brought about by their fear of finally losing somebody in power in Yemen who was willing to serve their interests when Hadi was, when he fled to Aden and the Houthis were in control of Sana'a. But going back to Hadi, like you said, his term was 2 years, and the 2 years had passed. He was appointed in 2011, and by 2015, he was still around. And January 2015, he resigned. So not only was his term up, but he also resigned. He tried to take back his resignation after he resigned, but technically his term was already up. So for him to be considered the legitimate president of Yemen is really, just mind-boggling and baffling. And he enjoys very, very little, if any, support in Yemen, even in South Yemen. He does not he makes official visits to South Yemen every now and then, and doesn't stay, on land for very long. He stays offshore, and, no longer than a week at a time because of fears for his safety. So this isn't a president that can, if there's an election right now, of course, he would never even, there's no chance of him winning. And there was never an election to begin with. A one-man election is not an election, it's an appointment. So he's not the president of Yemen, even though the UN recognizes him as such.
That's some good historical context to get us to, I would say, late 2014. So can we talk a little bit about what happened in the immediate months before Saudi Arabia began launching a bombing campaign with the support of the US? That was in March. At the end of 2014, the Houthi movement, which is known as Ansar Allah, and we'll discuss more about what this is. These are rebels from the north who, as I mentioned, are from the Zaidi sect, which makes up about 40 to 45% of Muslims in Yemen. The Houthis took control over large parts of the north, and they moved south toward the capital of Yemen, which is Sana'a. And then they took control of Sana'a, and Hadi fled. In fact, Hadi, the president we were discussing, the so-called internationally recognized president, he in fact fled to Saudi Arabia. So can you talk about the Houthi takeover of Sana'a? And then, of course, we also know now that at the time, the Houthis never planned on trying to govern the area. They actually were going to try to take over the capital as a political bargaining chip to negotiate. But then, of course, Saudi Arabia launched a bombing campaign.
Exactly. There was never a plan to take over. This isn't a coup by any, by any means. And I think they were able to take over Sana'a, or to enter Sana'a with Saleh basically, not intervening in that takeover. Again, as I mentioned, he still had vast control over the Yemeni army, even though he was no longer president. But I think they were trying to apply political pressure onto Hadi, who has just been sitting there for 3 years doing nothing, absolutely nothing. And, they agreed to sign a UN-sponsored deal to form some kind of unity government. But Hadi, again, was just not implementing any of the things he said he was going to implement under that agreement, under previous agreements. And so when he resigned, the Houthis, they were kind of left wondering what to do next, right? And so he fled initially to Aden, and then after that fled to Saudi Arabia. So I think if Saudi Arabia hadn't began bombing, which they did, 2 months into the new king's tenure, yes, there would have been probably clashes between Houthis and the Southerners, but it would have probably died down very easily because, again, the Houthis had no intention to govern Sana'a. They were trying to apply pressure to Hadi and get him to do the things he was supposed to do, that he was mandated to do. So, things escalated very quickly after they entered Sana'a. But if they hadn't entered Sana'a, I wonder, how long Hadi would have just remained on the seat doing nothing.
And this can get pretty complex, so I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but I'm curious what you think about the Houthi movement. I mentioned that this group, which is officially called Ansar Allah, originally comes from North Yemen, specifically from Saada, the major city in the north. And they're a Zaidi group, which is a Shia sect that is actually similar in many ways to mainstream Sunni theology. And they were formed in the 1990s after the reunification of Yemen, when you have the rise of Wahhabi influence from Saudi Arabia, and this very conservative right-wing Sunni movement starts to take a hold, and the Zaidis begin pushing back against some of this increased oppression. And what's interesting is that Hussein al-Houthi, who was the founder of the group, was in fact killed by Ali Abdullah Saleh, who was the former longtime leader of Yemen. And Saleh notoriously had an on and off relationship with the Houthis. In fact, from 2004 until 2010, for 6 years, there was a kind of low-intensity civil war between the government of Saleh and the Houthi movement in the north. But then what's strange is they later allied when the war in 2015 began. So we see that, there are shifting alliances in this conflict. But for listeners who want to understand the kind of centers of power in Yemen and the different parties, you mentioned the south, the former capital of South Yemen was Aden, which is one of the major cities. I mentioned Sana'a, which is the official capital of the country, which is in North Yemen. And then right at the north of the country near Saudi Arabia is Sada, which is the base of support for the Houthi movement. So can you talk more about the different political factions and your experience?
Right. So when the Houthis began, preaching in Sada, in their province, the grievances weren't that they were oppressed because they were Zaidi. President Saleh himself was Zaidi. They're, vast, like you said, 40 to 45% of the population in the north of Yemen is Zaidi. So this wasn't a religious or sectarian issue. I think part of their grievances were political, that Yemen was not behaving as a sovereign country. Saleh had, allowed the Americans and the Saudis to intervene in Yemen at various points. And, and there was vast corruption in the country. He was amassing wealth that was supposed to go to the country, and Yemen remained the Middle East's poorest country. And so their grievances and their preachers were speaking about, political change in Yemen. And they began forming, I would say, people started being sympathetical toward their needs because what they were saying was true. Yemen was this backward, very poor nation, even though we had wealth that could have sustained us, but, was going into the wrong hands and into corrupt hands. Saleh decided that they were a threat against him and waged war, and realized very quickly that he wasn't going to be able to defeat them. He enlisted the Americans under the pretense that they were allied with Iran. He enlisted the Saudis, and these guys were fighters and they resisted. And so, they just grew more powerful over the years. But I think now it's very difficult to know, to know if the Houthi movement today is the same as what it was in the late 90s and the early 2000s. I think that's for Yemenis to decide after this war, hopefully simmers down and foreign intervention ceases, because we're left with people who've made decisions that have impacted the country, people who've supported Hadi, who've supported foreign intervention, Islah members who are, many are now foreign agents essentially, but they're also linked to Al-Qaeda. And then you've got Houthis and members of Saleh's party. And so there are various people within the country, and I think it's up to Yemenis to decide what's the best course moving forward.
Yeah, the Houthis, as you mentioned, they were an adversary of Saleh. Then they formed an alliance with him. And then they basically iced him as he was trying to escape to Saudi Arabia. So it's pretty clear that this movement is, shifting with the political winds and seeking to survive by any means. How are they viewed inside Yemen beyond the Zaidi population? I think what you're saying is that the sectarianism that we've seen in Yemen is a result of the violence and not a cause of it. So how are they seen, and, what truth to what extent are the allegations by the U.S. true that they're being used as a proxy force, by the IRGC? We saw Nikki Haley's dramatic, presentation at the UN where she holds up, a piece of a hulk of a missile or a ballistic missile, and claims that it was, part and parcel of the Iranian strategy of destroying Yemen. And standing right before her is UAE Ambassador Yusuf Otaiba and various diplomats from the GCC. How much truth is there?
It's severely exaggerated. As far as I know, and this is just me spending some time looking at WikiLeaks cables between Saleh and the former ambassador to the U.S., the U.S. ambassador to Yemen. Saleh kind of made up this association between Iran and Houthis, hoping that the Americans would get involved in helping him with the Houthi problem in the early 2000s. And so, to what extent Iran is involved, I would say very minimal, if at all. Yes, clearly they support the Houthis. They support them in the media and otherwise, but to say that they're involved in a proxy war is absolutely misleading. Yemen is under full blockade by the Saudis and the Emiratis and the U.S. So, food is not coming in. Save the Children and Doctors Without Borders are having trouble bringing their personnel into Yemen. Children are dying because vaccines are not being allowed to enter the country by the Saudis, but we're led to believe that somehow missiles by Iran are mysteriously entering the country, and the Houthis are using those. The Houthis are using whatever weapons that Saleh had been stockpiling for the last 30-something years, and there aren't very many. I mean, it's 3 years, and you barely hear about missiles going into Saudi Arabia. There aren't very many attacks that the Houthis are waging against Saudi Arabia because they just don't have the capacity. So they're not supported by Iran militarily, but they do support some other forms of support.
Yeah, and this is a really important point. One of the things that I frequently cite in some of the articles I've written about this, and I wrote an article for Fairness and Accuracy Reporting last year called How Media Spreads CIA's Sectarian Anti-Iran Middle East Cold War Narrative.
A brief, memorable title there.
There's a really good succinct research paper published by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which is, a very mainstream think tank. It gets funding from the U.S. government, in fact. But a scholar published this great article called Iran's Small Hand in Yemen. And in this article, the scholar makes a few different points. One of the things that she writes is, quote, Iranian support for the Houthis has been marginal and does not shape their decision-making as much as local alliances and conflict dynamics do. And then she also writes, quote, claims of Iran's influence over the Houthis have been overblown. And you can go through several different points, but one of the main points you just raised is, where did these weapons come from? What a lot of people don't realize is that although the U.S. certainly has a lot of guns, per capita we have the most guns in the world. However, Yemen can compete with the U.S. for one of the most militarized countries. As you can probably speak more to this, Shireen, but it's very common that people throughout the country not only have, small guns like handguns, but even have rifles and kind of heavy weapons. So the idea that they would need more weapons in the first place, not only considering that history inside Yemen, but also considering the fact that throughout the 2000s, the U.S. sold a lot of weapons to Yemen under the pretext of the so-called war on terror. So the idea that the Houthis, which raided Sana'a, they allied with Salah and took much of the Yemeni army's reserve, the idea that they would need foreign arms shipments is simply disputed by the facts on the ground, which is that the UN panel of experts, which has released reports on this, show that there have been very few, if any, significant Iranian arms shipments. These are mostly weapons that have been inside the country for years, and many of them were provided by the U.S. So Foreign Policy published a report that showed that one of the ballistic missiles that the Houthis fired, it's true that it had some Iranian parts in it. It also had more American parts than Iranian parts.
Exactly. And you mentioned per capita ownership. Yemen is actually second after the U.S. And this is a country of 27 million, not 350 million. And so, we used to joke growing up that you can buy a tank in Yemen if you wanted to, if you had the right connections. And so it's not impossible to believe that, we were, Yemen was stockpiled, and that's what they've been using for the past 3 years, despite all the, bombing of, that the Saudis have been conducting over the past 3 years. So even during the time where Saleh and the Houthis were waging war with each other, and Saleh had, told the Americans that, they're receiving weapon shipments from Iran, the Americans actually did an investigation, and they found that all of the weapons that the Houthis were using were from the black market, and they were coming from the Yemeni army. And so even when they were waging war against Saleh, they were using Saleh's weapons. So they've been very resourceful in obtaining these weapons. And like you said, they've raided Sana'a. They have control over everything that Saleh had control over. So that's what they've been using. And so this isn't a war of equal proportions. This is, one country, not even a united country, just certain groups within the country trying to defend themselves with whatever weapons are available against an international coalition led by Saudi Arabia and the U.S.
You have Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in the U.S. right now. He's basically he's just engaged in a love fest with elite liberals from Oprah Winfrey to Elon Musk. I don't know if he's a liberal or just like some, weirdo futurist, but Silicon Valley is embracing him. He had a secret meeting at Harvard, basically to avoid having any students protest. MIT embraced him. It's pretty. It's a very revealing display, and it really shows that our kind of elites, particularly the liberals who talk about democracy promotion, only believe in democracy when it's sort of a convenient tool that can be weaponized against the so-called axis of evil. But here you have the leader of the most unfree world in the U.S. getting red carpet treatment. Beyond that, it seems like they're giving a green light to the assault on Yemen. And one of the things that Trump has done in his meeting with MBS is, he held out these childlike charts boasting of weapons sales to Saudi Arabia. I mean, when you're talking about F-35s, Lockheed Martin's terminal high altitude anti-aircraft device, which is supposed to, shoot down these kind of primeval ballistic missiles coming from Yemen, I guess, but also, tons of light weapons, tanks, armored vehicles. How much of these weapons, are going to be wielded against Yemen? How much are they contributing to the humanitarian crisis? And to what extent, in your opinion, is the treatment of MBS in the U.S. by, a who's who of elite liberals and our, kind of thought leaders, or what, me and Ben like to call our thought losers, to what extent are they giving the green light to the Yemen slaughter when, there should be, pressure for a negotiated settlement?
He, like you said, gets to go from coast to coast in the U.S. He was here at MIT, and we protested his visit, and we went to the MIT president's office and gave him signatures that had been collected online of over 6,000 people saying that MIT should rescind its invitation. Of course, the invitation took place, and I personally saw his motorcade with several police presence stroll through town over here last weekend. And he's going and meeting people like Kissinger and the Clintons and Oprah and so on.
And Obama, he's like, let's destroy your Iran deal, Obama. Oh, look, okay, sure, whatever. Show me the money.
So exactly, show me the money. It's exactly why people are meeting him. They have made enormous amounts of money from this man. And Trump was very transparent in a sense when he pulled those childlike, science posters and presented them. Apparently, MBS was embarrassed by that. But, at least Trump is being transparent about his relationship with the Saudis. And I mean, that's exactly why he's here, to secure more weapon deals and to make sure that that relationship continues. He's also meeting Lockheed Martin and so on. So, it's not just a blank check. It's enabled him to wage war and to create a humanitarian crisis as large as what he's done in Yemen. This war wouldn't be possible without the intensive support that the Saudis are receiving from the Americans. I mean, just last week, they couldn't even protect themselves from a missile that was coming from Yemen. And, instead of shooting the missile down, they shot themselves and bombed their own capital. And so these aren't very proficient people that we're talking about. The U.S. Army lists a whole host of services that they provide at the tune of $129 million per month. This is outside of weapon contracts, of course. And it includes, training and targeting and, even what did they say? They said, quote, how to lead by example, courses on communication, navigation, and how to lead by example. So the U.S. is heavily involved in training the Saudis. And so for them, Mohammed bin Salman represents somebody who's made us a lot of money. And why destroy that relationship? Who cares that millions of people are suffering and hundreds of thousands have been killed? Nobody really knows about Yemen, and so why should we really bother? We don't need to talk about democracy and human rights and all of that when we're making so much money out of this war.
Yeah, and I highly recommend that people go to YouTube and watch this short video of Trump in the Oval Office with Mohammed bin Salman. It is incredible. I thought it was satire. I mean, it is so dystopian. In the first 15 seconds, Trump commends Mohammed bin Salman, and he in the first 15 seconds he says, "We do a lot of arms sales with Saudi Arabia," and then less than a minute into the meeting, this press conference, he pulls out these signs and starts listing the billions of dollars of each arms sale, and then he says, "We love Saudi Arabia. They're creating jobs in our country," and specifically, I pointed out in a report I did for The Real News that on the second chart that Trump has, it's a map of the U.S., and it shows some of the states that he's targeting to create these weapons, and they're key swing states like Florida and like the Rust Belt. And it's part of Trump's strategy to try to win re-election is he is relying on $400 billion of Saudi investment in key states that could create jobs, so hopefully he can get more support to win the next presidential election.
Let's call it the dead baby swing state strategy.
Oh my God.
I mean, is that fair to say? I mean,
absolutely. Just today there was a massacre, and when I say massacre, there's no other way to describe it.
7 children.
7 children. Pictures of charred bodies. I can't even. What more evidence do people want that these weapons are the ones that are causing all of this, destruction and massacres in a country that has posed no threat to the United States or to its neighbors? Yet, we continue to wage war because it's making such good money for the United States.
I got an email passed on to me. I think it was by a Saudi dissident. The email's authentic. I don't actually know the identity of the person who passed it on to me. They did so anonymously, and it's from it details one of the people on the email is the wife of the grandson of Jacques Cousteau. Jacques Cousteau, who did the show on marine life and introduced, really helped spur the environmental movement. And the wife is an entertainment reporter, Amber Cousteau, and she's saying she and her husband are rushing back to Hollywood right now. They've been overseas and they're rushing back to meet with MBS because, the grandson is going to be the conservation director of a new resort on the Red Sea in Saudi Arabia. So everyone's just trying to get in on this MBS fiesta. And I really think it's very similar to the situation of the Palestinians, where Israel has so much influence and so many pro-Israel partisans convey so much power and wealth that basically the Palestinians are collateral damage. And it's the same situation with Yemen, except there really is no movement that I can see in the U.S. or there isn't the same one you have for the Palestinians to draw attention to the situation of Yemen. I guess I want to ask you, what you're doing and what kind of activism is taking place, and then second, where is diplomacy? Because the last I heard from the U.S. ambassador to Yemen, the Houthis were supposed to give up basically all their weapons and just unilaterally surrender as a condition for the U.S. withdrawing support. Extensive support for Saudi Arabia. What is the diplomatic situation?
The situation is that they want, not just the Houthis, they want Yemen to surrender to occupation. That's essentially what they're doing. And under no circumstances are Yemenis, whether Houthis or Saleh supporters or any other independent person in Yemen, would, really consider occupation, surrendering to occupation, especially given what we see occupation looks like in south of Yemen. So Saudi Arabia and the UAE control southern Yemen, where about 20% of the population lives. They share that, of course, with Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and there are assassinations every other day in Aden, where I'm from. There's no stability. There's, still vast poverty. There's all this control for power that's still happening. And so, why would any Yemeni agree to that is beyond me. Diplomacy isn't going to, any kind of solution to this problem can't begin unless the Saudis stop bombing and the U.S. stops, helping them with the bombing. But that basically, in essence, Saudi Arabia, it's in Saudi Arabia's hand to stop this war because they're the aggressor here. They're the ones who've attacked a sovereign country with their coalition of friends that they've gathered together from the Arab world and elsewhere. And unless that stops, there's no end in sight, because what's the other option? The other option is for Yemenis to surrender. And why would they want to do that?
Yeah, and I wrongly used the term collateral damage. I think the better term would be unworthy victims.
Right.
The Yemeni people are unworthy of our attention because their plight interferes with the foreign policy imperatives of the West. I mean, what are you doing, and what can be done to sort of change that dynamic? Because I think a lot of work has been done in the last 20 years to shift the dynamic on the way Palestinians are discussed in the West.
I think it's really important. First of all, people don't still, 3 years into this war, people don't know where Yemen is, let alone what's going on over there. But a lot of people I've spoken to, once they know what's happening and what our role is, what the U.S. government role is in Yemen, they're disgusted. They don't want something like this to be happening in their name. There is no way to justify what the U.S. is doing in Yemen, what Saudi Arabia is doing in Yemen, legitimate president or not. There's just no way to justify it. And so when people see that, I think I've met a lot of people here in Boston who are actively calling their senators and trying to bring about change and writing letters and whatnot, just to, show that this isn't something that we endorse. Weapon deals or not, this should not be happening in Yemen. Why are we involved in Yemen, right? And so I think that's the kind of work that we need to continue to amplify. There are a couple of celebrities that joined the cause recently. And so, that kind of visibility helps. But, again, just a lot of emphasis, it's not enough to talk about Yemen. It's really important to talk about the U.S.'s role in Yemen, because if the U.S. stops helping the Saudis can't continue to wage war in Yemen much longer.
Yeah, and this point is so crucial. And what's interesting is I frequently point out that in August of 2016, this is only about a little over a year, about a year and a half into the war, the New York Times editorial board published an op-ed, and the New York Times wrote pretty explicitly, quote, "The United States is complicit in the Saudi carnage in Yemen." And the editorial board acknowledged that if the U.S. were to withdraw support, the war would end. That was 2 years ago, and this war is still raging on. In the meantime, hundreds of thousands of people have died from preventable causes. And we'll get to that in a second. But specifically, you raise another important point about how unpopular this policy is. And unfortunately, there isn't really much polling. I haven't really seen any in the U.S. specifically about arms sales to Saudi and about the war in Yemen. However, recently, with Mohammed bin Salman's visit to the UK, there was polling done of people in the UK, and they found that only 6% of the British public support arms sales to Saudi Arabia. 6%.
It was Theresa May and, her coalition.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then another recent poll found that 75, so 3/4 of people in France oppose arms sales to Saudi Arabia. And I would imagine, we can't really estimate what it would be in the U.S., but I would imagine that a majority of Americans, if they were asked the question, they would be like, no, we should not be selling weapons to Saudi Arabia. So can you speak a little bit as to how this is not a popular war publicly? Like most wars, this is a war being waged by elites, and it's a war being waged by elites not just here, but in Saudi Arabia.
Right. You mentioned the UK, and I feel like the public there is a little bit more aware of what's going on in Yemen, because you have the leader of the opposition party, Jeremy Corbyn, who's, mentioned time and time again that the UK should not be involved in Yemen, that they are helping create this disaster. Here recently, you have Bernie Sanders, who began to speak about it. But again, there was no news coverage, very little news coverage when he introduced the bipartisan bill to try to get the Senate to, stop waging war in Yemen. So the media here is still very silent on what's going on in Yemen, let alone the U.S.'s role. I think in all of 2017, MSNBC had exactly one report about, the war in Yemen. And so if people are not aware about what's going on, I don't think they'd have much to say. But still, if given any kind of information, I can't foresee that this has any support. Again, why are we just destroying a country for the sake of weapons, that doesn't seem to mesh well with the average person's, sensibilities, right? And so I think just awareness of the public about how involved their government is, what their government has done, and it's bipartisan. It started under President Obama and it's continued on to Trump, with no beats missed in between. And it just continues for the sake of making money. That's what we've reduced human life to. Well, it's making us so much money. Let's not really. And even looking at casualties, you mentioned the hundreds of thousands of people have died. That's a figure that barely gets mentioned. You hear the 10,000 people killed figure, which was, I think, the UN's figure from January 2016. And so, many more people have been killed by airstrike, and hundreds of thousands have died because of lack of water and, diseases like cholera and malnutrition, starvation. And so this is a disaster that, we've helped create, and we could stop if we were to stop, helping Saudi Arabia out of all countries. Mohammed bin Salman was, recently there was a 60 Minutes interview, and she introduced him as an emancipator of women. This is the man who's waging war on a country of 27 million. He has his mother under house arrest and whatnot. But hey, he allowed women to drive. Whoop-de-doo, right? It's 2018. We're supposed to celebrate that. He's allowed movie theaters to be shown in, movies to be shown in Saudi Arabia for the first time. So we're supposed to, celebrate those things as somehow being liberal and, positive, but while we're ignoring the fact that he's an autocrat and somebody who's waging war on his neighbors and his cousins and anybody who opposes him.
Yeah, I think Mohammed bin Salman has liberated, I think, something like 113,000 Yemeni children in the first 22 months of the U.S.-Saudi war from being alive. So there's that. I have one idea on how to draw more U.S. media attention to Yemen, which is to change Mohammed bin Salman's name to Vladimir Putin. We can at least get Rachel Maddow on the case. But, Ben, you've been kind of banging on for probably years about the undercounting of deaths in Yemen, and our media overcounts deaths in Syria. Not to say there aren't a lot of deaths there, but I mean, I wonder if you both can kind of weigh in on the undercounting of deaths and the kind of discounting in general of the human toll, which is a lot of these deaths are a result of the humanitarian situation. Yeah,
and this is something that I've written about a little bit, and I've tweeted about incessantly because I've been tracking this. In fact, I was looking recently. I was writing articles for Mondoweiss in 2015 at a time when no one was really publishing anything on Yemen. I couldn't get it published anywhere.
In English.
Oh, yeah, in English. I mean, it's always important to stress that, in Arabic, there's been a lot of coverage of this. But in terms of English language Western media, it's always been pretty barren, but especially in 2015. And what's been interesting is in these past 3 years, watching the U.S. media reports and even the United Nations reports on death tolls. So as Shireen acknowledged, in January of 2017, so this is about a year and a half into the war, UN OSHA, the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, published a report by Jamie McGoldrick, who's the Yemen coordinator, that said that 10,000 Yemeni civilians had been killed and 40,000 had been injured. And then also the Associated Press was reporting in January of 2017 that there were 10,000 deaths. Well, here we are now in 2018, and that still continues. Like that figure has not changed in the past 13 months. They still say 10,000 deaths.
Actually, sometimes they say 5,000s now. So somehow 5,000 people are supposed to come back to life or something.
Of course. So the number goes down. As Max mentioned, the United Nations stopped counting deaths in Syria in 2014, and they just keep adding. They keep saying 500,000, 600,000. The most recent estimate, again, it's absolutely horrific. It's probably 350,000, but it shows an example of how Yemen, which is ignored, where the U.S. is responsible for the war crimes, Yemen's death toll is whitewashed and erased, whereas in Syria, where the Syrian government is responsible for the majority of the deaths, they keep ramping those up. But specifically, this 10,000 deaths thing is also misleading because it only considers violent deaths. So even if we considered this as the actual estimate, which it's a gross underestimate, it's probably tens of thousands of violent deaths, that still doesn't consider the vast majority of the people who have died because of the war, which is children and even many adults and elderly people who have died from, as you mentioned, hunger, lack of water, and disease. And this is not a matter of speculation. In fact, UNICEF reported in early 2017 that in the previous year, 63,000 Yemeni children died from preventable causes, just in 2016. And then Save the Children also reported in November of 2017 that 50,000 Yemeni children died from hunger and disease in the first 10 months of 2017. So that's more than 113,000 Yemeni children who died from preventable causes in 22 months. No mention of that anywhere. You have to dig to find it. It's very difficult. So we have mainstream organizations acknowledging that hundreds of thousands of people are dying, but there's no coverage.
Exactly. And that figure, 113,000 children, we haven't even counted the adults here. This is just a number of children who have died from preventable diseases. And these are diseases that did not exist in Yemen before the war. We didn't have diphtheria in Yemen. The last case was in 1992. And now there are cases of diphtheria in the thousands. We didn't have cholera in Yemen. And now, the number is over 1 million people infected with cholera. And the treatment for cholera, is clean water. There's no clean water in Yemen because, again, blockade and the Saudis, bombing water facilities and whatnot. And so, 10,000 figures. Those are the people who were killed by airstrikes and other means. Yemenis report at least 15,000 and 113,000 children. How many adults, how many people in total have been killed by this war from 2015? We don't even know that. But somehow, we see the figures of 5,000 civilians killed and, so as to, which is still a huge number, but really does not at all reflect the reality of the situation in Yemen.
Another aspect of this catastrophe is, it relates to an issue that we like to talk about a lot on Moderate Rebels, which is how U.S. foreign policy has strengthened the cause of the moderate rebels of Al-Qaeda and its allies around the globe. The International Crisis Group published a report, and the essence of the report is that the U.S. and Saudi-led war in Yemen has really been a boon for Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and it's allowed them to grow and benefit from the instability. To what extent is that still the case? And, can you just talk about the role of Takfiri groups like Al-Qaeda and Daesh in Yemen?
I mean, first of all, we have reports and evidence and, confirmed proof that the Hadi government was working directly with Al-Qaeda against the Houthis. I mean, Frontline and BBC were there, and they captured the footage of fighters who were pro-Hadi fighters, pro-Saudi fighters, working alongside Al-Qaeda fighters. And so, that's one aspect. The other aspect is that there are people within Hadi's government who are appointed by Hadi who are, terrorists, who are considered Al-Qaeda terrorists. So we are helping a government, essentially, a quote-unquote legitimate government, has no problem working with terrorists when it sees fit, has no problem appointing terrorists to high position. And somehow we're still fighting terror in that region. So for Yemenis, it's a very confusing, policy. On the one hand, you're supporting people who are working with terrorists. On the other hand, you're saying that you're working against terrorists. The only people who are, who have a proven record of working against Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Yemen are the Houthis prior to any kind of foreign intervention. And so, absolutely, intervention, the U.S.'s intervention, Saudi's intervention has enabled terrorists in Yemen, have enabled groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, who right now share territory, the 20%, where 20% of the population lives in Yemen, that's technically under Hadi's control. It's also under Al-Qaeda and ISIS control. So, again, this is one of the things that northern Yemenis see, and why should they surrender to Saudi and other forces when they know that this could be a problem then in North Yemen as well?
We do want to segue a bit. We don't have too much time left, and I want to hear more about your experiences, and also want to talk more about the North-South divide. But really quickly, I think another key point in media coverage that gets very little attention, we talked about U.S. arms sales being a crucial factor. Of course, the U.S. has strongly supported Saudi Arabia since the 1930s. On FDR's last Valentine's Day, in fact, before he passed away, he met with the Saudi king, Ibn Saud, and made a famous pledge to support Saudi Arabia in return for access to its oil, of course. So this goes back a long time, but one of the important points in regard to Yemen is very poor and it doesn't have many natural resources, but its geopolitical location is incredibly important and strategic for the region. This is one of the reasons that Saudi Arabia has for so long tried to conquer this area, specifically the Bab al-Mandab, the Mandab Strait, which is right on the southwest coast of Yemen, where a lot of fighting has been. And in fact, there are numerous U.S. ships from the U.S. Navy that have been enforcing a blockade, and even sometimes firing inside into Hodeidah, the city there near the coast. Also, we know that 3 to 4 million barrels of oil per day goes through the Mandab Strait. And of course, the Houthis and the southern government have fought a lot over this very crucially strategic region. What's funny is I actually just got up, the U.S. Energy Information Administration published a report last August titled 3 Important Oil Trade Checkpoints Are Located Around the Arabian Peninsula. And it talks about the importance of Yemen strategically. So there's also the issue of water. Of course, Saudi Arabia, being largely desert, is constantly water insecure, and there have been discussions that one of the reasons it's so motivated by this war is to gain access to water reserves that Yemen has and access to the water on the coast that Saudi Arabia does not have. Do you want to comment on that and also the role that Yemen's geopolitical location has played in this conflict?
Yeah, I think unfortunately for Yemenis, we've been cursed by having a neighbor to the north called Saudi Arabia and, a strategic location, which is Bab al-Mandab, controlling Bab al-Mandab Strait, where, basically Saudi oil is traveling every day in the millions of barrels. And so, yeah, of course, Saudi Arabia wanted to maintain, they want to maintain control over Yemen because of their strategic location. I think the other motivation for Saudi Arabia is if you look at the Arabian Peninsula, the Gulf countries, they're either sultanates or kingdoms or emirates. Yemen really is the only republic in that country. And I think the 2011 revolution really stressed Saudi out. They don't want a democracy on their southern border. They don't want any kind of influences like that on their population, which very much supports the kingdom right now. So, yeah, a combination of our history and our location, unfortunately, and the fact that we don't have as many resources. And we've been managed by very corrupt leaders who have enriched themselves and not the Yemeni people and have placed us in this position, unfortunately.
So we talked about the war itself. Let's talk a little bit more about the actual political situation inside Yemen. Shireen, you've mentioned that you're from the south, from Aden, which used to be the capital of South Yemen. In 1990, South and North Yemen were reunited. But today, even though they technically are reunited, there are huge political fractures. In fact, at this point, it looks like the country is separate again. The South has this government that has almost become a kind of colony, not just of Saudi Arabia, but more of the United Arab Emirates, which is doing massive capital investment, is building new projects, and the UAE has created its own security forces called the Security Belt, which are like this kind of like Wahhabi-style paramilitaries that are paid by the UAE in the south. And meanwhile, in the north area, this is under the control of the Houthis. So can you talk about the north-south divide in Yemen, which a lot of people who might even know about the war aren't privy to, and this is one of the key political factors of what's been happening?
Right. So Yemen was under Ottoman control in the north and British control in the south for over 120 years. South Yemen, with the capital Aden, was under the control of the British, and my mom grew up under British occupied Aden. And in the 80s, in the 60s, the Yemenis revolted against the British left, and northern Yemen was having its own revolution against the imams, the Zaydi imams who were controlling it at the time after the Ottomans left. So you had two countries eventually early in 1990 that decided to unite. The historic northern portion and southern portion, as they used to be called, were finally going to unite under Saleh, who was president of the north and became president of Yemen, and Saddam al-Bid, who was president of the south and became his vice president. Well, within 4 years of that unity, the southern Yemenis decided that the unity wasn't working for them, that they were underrepresented in parliament, that they weren't getting the same kind of privileges that the northern Yemenis were getting. Of course, northern Yemenis make up 80% of the population compared to southern Yemen. And so in 1994, and this is a war I personally lived through, the South declared independence from the North, and the North attacked. And it was a 3-month war that, was eventually won by Saleh, and he asserted control over the South after that war. So the southern Yemenis since then have viewed the northern forces as occupying forces. So they've considered themselves under occupation by the North. Now, what surprises me as somebody from the South, if you're so against occupation from the North, then why do you support occupation by the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia or any other country? Unfortunately, the Southerners have embraced the UAE and Saudi Arabia, maybe less so Saudi Arabia now, and more so the UAE. There's a UAE-backed government called the Southern Transition Council, and of course the Saudi-backed Hadi, who's based in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. And so the divisions are worse than they've ever been. But in my view, it's been a very disappointing turn of events for southern Yemenis to embrace foreign occupation and not be able to put their differences aside in the face of foreign intervention.
What I've also been surprised to hear from speaking to Yemeni friends from both the North and the South is that there's this ridiculous Western narrative that's common in the media that tries to explain everything in sectarian religious terms. So it's always Sunni, Shia, it's whatever. But what's interesting is that I've heard that because, there are things like different license plates for people from Sana'a, from the north, and Aden in the south, that it's not a religious sectarianism, there's a kind of regional sectarianism that this war has made much, much worse, where people, if you're from the north and you go to the south or vice versa, there's a lot of mistrust and even kind of hatred that this war has fueled. So it is true that the majority of the Zaydis are in the north, but this is not a religious sectarianism. Can you talk about your experience with that kind of political division and how the war has made that even worse?
Right. I think the southern Yemenis, viewing themselves as the victim of the northern occupation, have built up resentment toward their northern neighbors. Resentment that I grew up with even when I was still living in Yemen before we left. You don't see that resentment. It doesn't seem to be too much of a two-way street. The northerners are oftentimes baffled by why the southerners really hate them. They themselves endured under President Saleh for the long time, and not everybody in the north supported Saleh. And so, instead of this being a grudge that the Southerners should have had against Saleh and his party, by the way, I should remind people too that during the occupation or the war on the south of Yemen, President Hadi was the one who led that war, but somehow these things are conveniently ignored by the Southerners. He was awarded vice presidency because of his role in the 1994 war. So, there's definitely regional discrimination. It has nothing to do with sectarianism. Religious identities are very different in the north compared to the south. The north has a long, long history of Shafi'i Sunnism, as well as Zaydism, which is a branch of Shia Islam. While the south, really, because they were under British occupation and then a Marxist government, religion didn't play a big part in that region at all for many, many years. And then Saudi Arabia saw a vacancy there, and in the 90s started pumping our education system in the south with Wahhabi doctrine. And I remember the textbooks and all the things that we were taught in the south, that the northerners were able to resist to a large degree because of the strong traditions that already existed, whether Sunni Islam or Shia Islam, but the South was more, susceptible to that indoctrination by Saudi Arabia. And so you have groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS that have arisen and today, mostly in the south, and very little of that in the north.
So we tried to walk through, try to explain the historical context and the political context of the war, the humanitarian catastrophe, which, again, the United Nations has said is the largest in the world. Maybe we can zoom in a little bit, Shireen, and I'm interested, how has this impacted you personally? Do you want to speak about the impact on your family and your community? Because frequently, when we talk in the kind of abstract about these political conflicts, we forget that the lives of so many Yemenis have been destroyed. And I think it's really important to highlight those personal impacts as well.
Yeah, I think that's the part that, has motivated me to speak out. I wouldn't consider myself an activist. I just was somebody who, saw this immense destruction and very little attention being brought to it. And so for me, it's very personal. I have family members in all parts of Yemen, Aden, Sana'a, Taiz, Hodeidah, and they've suffered tremendously. Of course, not as much as other people, because we've seen, people who have died in the hundreds of thousands. For many Yemenis, they're living on the edge, but for many other Yemenis, they've already gone off the edge. It's for many people in many areas are on the verge of famine, whereas some areas have already, experienced famine. And so it's something that's really devastated every family in Yemen. Everybody's been affected by it in one way or another. People who had jobs, people who were, students, people who had, just ordinary lives like yours and mine have been affected. There's a lot of uncertainty. It's becoming harder every day for people to find food, for people to find water, for people to have any kind of hope in a future. And it's just something that I try to dissociate from, just to be able to speak about it objectively. But it's been really very difficult to see people in all parts of Yemen suffer just so much for something that is no fault of their own. And every time there's an airstrike, we have to get in touch with family and make sure everybody's okay. There've been several close calls. If it's been so stressful for me, I can't even imagine what kind of trauma people are going through over there on a daily basis, when it's themselves and their lives and their families and their children that they have to worry about. They don't know. Somebody said to me, we don't know if we're going to die of airstrikes or of hunger or lack of medicine. And so these are very real threats that people experience on a daily basis. And it's just been completely devastating to see.
Well, I think, this is just a call for more action to draw attention to what's happening in Yemen, but specifically the central role of the United States in it, the complete abdication of diplomatic responsibility of the U.S. and the failure of our media across the West to even make an attempt at educating the public about the causes of the war, the context of it. So we're really grateful for the work you're doing and for joining us here, and we'll continue to stay in touch, and to promote your work. As always, listeners of this show can check out the show notes that we put together, which will provide you with more resources for understanding the crisis in Yemen and the role of the West in driving this crisis alongside Saudi Arabia. Finally, I would just say that, Ben was continuing to cover this at The Real News. TheRealNews.com is going to be one of the rare resources in English for continued and sustained coverage of Yemen. So check that out as well.
And Shireen, thank you so much for joining us. I mean, you've done so much excellent work on this, and it's always great to see you speaking out. I'm glad finally some media outlets have been opening up a little bit and doing a little more coverage, and I'm optimistic that we can, force them to cover this even more.
Thank you so much for having me, and especially, Ben, for the important work you've been doing. You were one of the very few people at the very beginning of the war who began to write about Yemen in a very responsible and ethical manner. So I really appreciate the work you're doing and for having me on your show.
Oh, that means so much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Moderate Rebels. As always, we will have show notes for our episode, and our website is moderaterebelsradio.com. If you would like to support what we're doing here at Moderate Rebels, and if you'd like to gain access to exclusive content, please consider subscribing at our Patreon page. That is patreon.com/moderaterebels. And of course, we're on social media. We're on Twitter @moderateRadio. and we're on Facebook at Moderate Rebels Radio. Thanks for listening.